Hi friends, so we're going to be reviewing a book today called The Psychology of Money. Now I personally chose this book because I really enjoy reading books on self-help and productivity and time management and asset management. And this book is a great book for somebody like me who has little information or a little less training in the backgrounds of finance and investment because I actually work as a dentist. Let's start with this. The first chapter is about the introduction of the book. Now, this book kind of starts off with the premise that you don't have to be very smart to kind of know investing, but how your money kind of behaves in the long term depends more on how your behavior is or your soft skills as an individual versus how smart you actually are at getting a market return. So this book kind of states that you don't really have to be too smart to make money, but it's just your behavior towards the fluctuations in the market which will dictate how you will make money in the longer run. So the introduction starts off with the idea and a small anecdote of a janitor. He was working in a high school for the longest period of time. His name was Ronald Reed, and he had a meager salary of about $6,000, which progressed to $8,000 when he retired. He passed away at the age of 92 years, and he left behind a massive sum of $8 million in investments, out of which 6 million he donated to healthcare and library facilities in the town where he lived in. Now, what's most interesting is that this janitor, who had a meager salary and was only a high school graduate, could accrue so much amount of wealth over such a long period of time, versus most of us who have been to college and are working in high-profile jobs fail to accrue a large amount of money because we never stick to our principles. And that's what this book is about. And let's go forward and read. So chapter 1 begins with the premise that everybody views the world with a different financial lens. So what this basically means is that how you've been brought up and how you spend most of your adult life kind of distinguishes how you view the world in terms of money, investment, expenses, and finances, and all of these factors, right? So it's a very interesting story that the author puts in this situation about how a lot of African Americans in the United States end up buying lottery tickets, and they are the majority of the population that buys these lottery tickets. Now, if you look at why they do, these repeated kind of behaviors or these acts, or why they keep buying lottery tickets, is basically because they are thinking of living the great American dream, which most of the Americans realize is an accepted or a norm for them. But these African Americans who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are trying to achieve these situations where they are living the same American dream as the rest of the Caucasians. Now, this is a great way of explaining how every individual gets affected by their adult life experiences and how their adult life experiences kind of shape their ideologies towards investments and finances. Right, so the author calls chapter 2 as luck and risk. Now, he calls both of them very interestingly as doppelgangers or siblings. And he has a very short anecdotal story about Bill Gates in this chapter. So he describes the story as follows. He says that Bill Gates basically studied in a high school called the Lakeside High School, just outside Seattle. And he had a professor in school, or a teacher in school, who basically was the pioneer, and he brought a computer to the school using the mother's fund of the Lakeside School, which was about $3,000. And this was one of the first schools to have a computer. Now, Bill Gates says that if he never had an experience at high school of using a computer, there would never have been anything as great as Microsoft, which is what luck is all about, right? So the author also describes and says, when we make decisions about our own finances and we fail, we generally describe it as a risk that we took. Versus if somebody does a decision about their financial future and they fail at it, or it does not go as planned, then they will generally say that it's because of a bad decision making power of that person. So this chapter brings into light how luck and risk have to be equally weighed and balanced when you're making your own financial decisions, and before judging somebody else's financial decisions also, because we don't know what situations the other person was in when he made them. So the author titles chapter 3 as Never Enough. Now this is very aptly titled and very applicable for our generation. What the author describes in this chapter is basically a soft skill which is very important, and he describes it as saying that the most important financial behavior is to stop the goalpost from moving any further. it's very important for us to understand that we should not sacrifice what we currently have and what we currently need for something that we don't have and we probably don't need. So he says that happiness is basically reality minus expectations. So we should learn to be happy in what we currently have, and we should learn to enjoy what we have rather than constantly chase some things which are not in our control. He also describes that the financial social glass ceiling is so high that it is virtually impossible for anyone to reach it. So the fourth chapter in this book is called Confounding Compounding. Now this is a very interesting chapter in this book, and I really like the story that the author has put into it. Now he's describing how Warren Buffett over the time has built about $84.5 billion of wealth, and maybe today he has even more. Now the author describes that Warren Buffett was not just a good investor, and the money that he's made is just not a result of him being a good investor or a good stock picker. What the author emphasizes here is the fact that Warren Buffett has been investing since the age of 10 years. He's been investing in stocks, in finance for almost a quarter of a century. Now this is very important to understand because most of us young investors are looking for quick short-term investment solutions that make our money double in a very short amount of time. The author also emphasizes the fact that when all the money put together of Warren Buffett is looked back retrospectively, he made about $81.5 billion of his current net worth after the age of his mid-60s or after his retirement kicked in, which is very important for us to understand because he did not accumulate the majority of his wealth when he was young. It was mostly in the last 1/3 of his career that the majority or the 90% of his wealth and his earnings came into being. So what the author is very correct in saying in this context is basically you've got to pick the right stocks or the right fund and let time do its own thing. And that's the power of compounding, which people also call as the eighth wonder of the world. Getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. Now, in this chapter, the author is kind of emphasizing on the fact that you might get rich, but to be rich or stay wealthy for a long term is what is the real game. What the author describes in this chapter is that once you have the money, to maintain that money requires a combination of paranoia versus frugality. So you need to be paranoid about what you are doing, and you have to be frugal in combination to actually conserve that wealth that you amassed so far. He says that more than insight, more than brains, more than the inability to predict stocks and how they will perform, it is the ability to sit tight and hold on for a long term that makes the bigger difference in making the money, what most people don't see. More than making big money, what investors should be focused on is the belief that they do not want to be financially dependent on their jobs. They should have that in mind, and the fact that they want to be financially unbreakable is what the target or the motive of all investments should be. Also, he emphasizes on the fact that you should always plan for what happens if your plan A does not work out. And that is the most important part of all your investment planning. So chapter 6 is titled Tales You Win. Now this chapter has two very nice stories that I'd like to share with you. The first is of Walt Disney. Now Walt Disney worked on over 400 different cartoons before he got famous. All 400 of these cartoons did well to different extents and gave him successes and failures in combination. But it wasn't until the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out that Walt Disney became a huge success, and he could actually pay off his debts, and he could give some sort of incentives to his workers. The second story is of Amazon. Now Amazon had been working with a lot of different products from travel agencies to Fire phones. But what really put them on the map was when they started launching Amazon Prime and the different web series. This is when the growth of Amazon took off exponentially. So what both these events describe are known as tail end events. What the author describes in this particular chapter is that it really does not matter what you do most of the time along your investing career. It might be investing in highs or lows, but it's that 0.00001% of the time that you do something which will be a part of a tail end event and which will make a dramatic difference to your investments and your investment career. So tail ends are always the things which will govern your success or failures. If you're a part of a tail end that is growing, then you will make money exponentially. And if you just withdraw right before a tail end happens, then you might fail and you might not get the success that you always wanted. So it really doesn't matter what you do most of the times. It's really a matter of what you are doing unknowingly and unconsciously, that 0.0001% of the time, that is going to determine if your investments become an exponential success or a disastrous failure. Now, chapter 7 talks about freedom. Now, freedom is one of the most closest topics to my heart and the reason why I keep investing for the long term. Now, what the author very nicely describes, that what money can buy you is the power of controlling your own time. And this is the highest dividend any investment can pay you. What this basically means is, say for example, you lost your job, or for some reasons you are unable to continue working. What having money in the bank or in investments will let you do is to explore options, look for jobs or alternatives rather than having to jump at the first available job because you have to make your household needs complete. So what money does is it gives you the flexibility of retiring when you have to. It also gives you the flexibility of having to manage a medical emergency without actually breaking the bank. Financial freedom and flexibility to do your own things at your own time, and the ability to do so gives you a sense of freedom that is unparalleled to anything that money can buy itself in any materialistic manner. What this chapter basically describes is that when you look at a man driving a fancy Mercedes or a BMW or a Rolls Royce, you look at the car and you look at the man and you generally say, wow, I wish I had the car. You never look at the car and the man and say, wow, that man is so cool that he owns this car. So basically, when you're driving a fancy car trying to impress the people around you, you fail to understand the fact that you're not impressing anybody. It's your materialistic wealth which is making the other person feel that, oh, the car is impressive, or the house is impressive, or that vacation is impressive. He does not think that you as an individual are cool because you have that car or because you have that home. People look at your wealth and your materialistic properties and feel that that is a standard that they should achieve for them to look cool. And they don't think that you are cool because you own them. So you're basically not impressing anybody by your own wealth. You're only instigating the person looking at your wealth to feel that if he owns that wealth, he will also be admired and he will also be looked up upon. So chapter 9 focuses on the title which says wealth is what you don't see. Now this chapter basically compares the rich and the wealthy. Now rich is something which is current. So if I had to describe you, if you had a salary of say $100,000 or $1 million say, and you're spending it all in one go every month, then you're said to be rich, and you're spending this all on say fancy clothes, fancy shoes, having a fancy house, versus being wealthy. Now wealthy is something that you generally don't see. It is something that is accrued over a long time. So wealth basically means that you're not using up what you have today to give you options for buying something tomorrow. And the idea is that if you have say 10 rupees today and you spend the amount today, you will have 10 rupees worth of material. But if you end up saving those 10 rupees and those 10 rupees progress to becoming say 100 rupees in the next 5 years, you will be able to buy something more with those 100 rupees at that point of time than what you could with those 10 rupees to begin with. So wealth is something that is more a long-term concept, and that is something much more invisible. But the value of wealth lies in the fact that you can buy something much more eventually with that money than what you can buy with that money today and fulfill your short-term desires. So coming to the next chapter, which is chapter 10, which is titled Save Money. It's a very simple title, and of course makes so much sense. The author kind of wiggles around the idea that you don't have to think of a particular goal or a motive in life to why you want to save money. The reason you should save money is just because. I mean, there's no specific reason why you should be thinking of saving money, because savings are basically a hedge for an emergency day when you might need money for something that you've not accounted for in life. So the author describes that saving money is very easy. You don't need to actually increase your income to save more money. What you need to do is increase your humility, and that rests right under your ego. So, very easily put, how can you actually save more? So, the author describes that you can save more if you end up spending less. You will end up spending less if you have less desires. And of course, you will have less desires if you stop comparing yourselves to the other people around you, and you also stop putting so much thought into what other people are thinking about you. So that's the most important takeaway point from this chapter, is to not really care what other people think about you, but kind of put your humility at the pedestal up there and think of that as how that's going to help you in the longer run. Save more money and be more flexible and controlling of your own time. Chapter 11 compares being reasonable or being rational as an investor. Now, this is a very simple, short chapter in the book, and what I take away from this is that a reasonable investor is somebody who thinks that whatever his logic is or his imperfect technical planning is going to work for him in the longer run. The chances of him sticking to his reasonable logic with its technical flaws are greater versus somebody who is more rational, who puts a lot of maths and statistics in his planning but is not able to stick to his planning in the longer run. So the author says that if you're a reasonable investor, the chances or the probability that you will stick to your investments in the longer run are more compared to being a rational investor who will constantly overanalyze his investments with maths and statistics and industry data and might not end up sticking to his investments, rationalizing them at every point in his life. So being a reasonable investor is a better option than being a very rational investor. So chapter 12 in the book is titled Surprise. It's no surprise that why the author has titled this chapter as so, because what he's trying to emphasize in this book is that things that have never happened before happen all the time. Like, say for example, nobody anticipated the corona pandemic that would happen from 2019, 2020 and now even into 2021. So he says that investment and taking into account historical data regarding investments should not be too heavily relied upon. Now, why this should not be done is because the author says there are two main things that can happen. The first thing that can happen is that if you take into account too much of the historical data and you fall back too much on it, you will miss the outlier events. Now, these outlier events, like even what I talked about them before, are that 0.0001% of the events that generally happen during your investment lifetime that will move your investment needle the most in either in a good or in a bad direction. So what's important is to understand that you have to kind of make your own judgment from the history but not be over dependent on it. So what the author says is that what you need to take away from these historical events that happen in the investment history is that you just need to take the general points out of these. It's basically things like how people reacted to fear, people's response to greed, people's response to incentives, and how they behave when the market is in a paranoia. These are the points that stay common from generations. So these are the takeaway points that one should absorb from these events over a long time. And they should kind of learn from these general behavioral patterns of people. Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is about room for error. Now, the author says that in life you should always plan for some degree of room for error happening. He says that if you're investing and you're looking at historical returns for the same amount of your investments, you should always assume that your investments will give you only about 1/3 of what returns have been achieved by the same amount in history. And this is because he says then you will be mentally prepared to kind of plan in just that much amount, and you will understand the gravity of investing in the long term. He also says that everything that can break will eventually break. So, which means that if something can go wrong, there will be that possibility that it will go wrong at some point of time in its lifetime. And that can also be with your investments. He gives a very interesting story about German tanks. So, at one point of the war, Germans had about 140 tanks which they had kind of placed in different war fields. Now, while the war was not active, these tanks were inactive or not being used. And when the war took place, they had to move these tanks to the war field. Now, when they tried resuming the action of these tanks, they noticed that about 120 of these tanks, only 20 of the tanks kind of worked. And they went back inside these tanks and started looking as to what went wrong. And what they found was that mice had kind of crept into the crevices and they had eaten away into all the electrifications of the tank. Can you imagine that no engineer or no electrical designer ever thought that mice would be a problem for such a huge tank and the functioning of these kind of tanks, and that they should account for something as small as mice to cause these tanks from not working? So chapter 14 is focused on you'll change, which is obvious because over your entire investment history, which might be over 10, 20 or 30 years, you as an individual, as an investor are going to change, and that should not be something that's unaccounted for. Your desires, your passions, your things that you want, your things that are important to you, all will change over time. So we should all accept the desires of the changing mind, and that our needs over time continue to change as you as an individual continue to change. Also remember the factoring in of sunk cost. What sunk cost basically means is that when you are anchoring your current decisions to your past effort, they will act in a devilish way, which means that if you're constantly making decisions today based on your efforts of yesterday or your investments of yesterday, you will fail to see the future, and then you will fail to get out at the right time. So always try and avoid sunk costs, think in a reasonable way, and try and move your investments so that they start kind of compounding again without waiting for the previous mistakes to kick in and affect your investments in the long term. So chapter 15 is titled Nothing's Free in This World. Basically, that's the truth, and that is something that we all have to accept. And the part of accepting that nothing is free in the investment world comes with volatility, fear, doubt, and regret of maybe not making the decision at the right time. The author gives an example of going to Disneyland, right? So when you go to Disneyland, you buy a ticket which is of say $100 fee. You think of this fee as a fee that you're kind of paying, or a price that you're paying for the entire days of fun that you're having. You're not thinking of this as a fine or as a bad thing for the fun that you're going to have in the entire day, right? So when you think of your investments, you should think of volatility as a fee, or your fear or your doubt in your investments as a fee that you're going to pay in the long term, because you are going to achieve the fun at the end of it, or the growth of your investments at the end of your investment cycle, right? So you have to understand that even at Disneylands, there can be a rainy day. So you might end up paying $100 fee, but there's a rainy day which is beyond your control, right? So sometimes you have to understand that these rainy days can also occur with your investments. But the important thing is to look past these days of fear and self-doubt and focus on the long term and the bigger picture. And then you'll always be more self-reliant and you'll have more confidence in your investments. Right, so chapter 16 is titled You and Me. And this chapter basically describes how every individual is a different investor, right? You can't compare my investment strategies and my philosophies to something that you do as an individual person, because we, like I kind of summed up in the first chapter itself, everybody has a different premise of investing, and that is a reflection of how they see money and financial planning during their adult life. So the author kind of gives this as a very simple example. Basically, see if there's a day trader versus a long-term investor. Now both of them are going to buy stocks, say today, and say the Google stock is selling at $100. Now a day trader might buy it at $100 because he will sell it for a gain of a couple of dollars, and he will, make that profit and walk out at the end of the day. Versus somebody else, say, who is looking at it as a short-term investment for a couple of months. Now he is going to look at the performance of Google as a company in the past few months, or in the past few weeks, or in how it's going to do in the coming days to weeks time. And again, comparing this to somebody who is an even long-term investor, say who's looking to put money for 10 or 20 years, he's going to look at the picture of Google compared to other companies who are in that same sector, and how that technology or that sector is going to perform in the next 10 to 20 years of time. So everybody's outlook to investing in the same company or in the same share at a given point of time may be different. Like I said, it really depends on what kind of an investor are you. So the idea to take cues regarding investments or get influenced by somebody else regarding your investments is a very bad idea, because he might have a different financial goal in mind versus you, who might be looking at the same investment for a different purpose. So think of it as you being the owner and the driver of your own car, of your own investment vehicle, and all the decisions that you make should only be influenced by your desires, your needs, and your long-term planning of what that investment means to you. Chapter 17 deals with the idea of seduction of pessimism. Now, what this chapter basically explains is that pessimism is more acceptable and more plausible as an explanation when given to you as an individual versus an optimistic explanation. For example, if a smart person who's good at picking his stocks tells you that this company is going to progress exponentially in the coming days and you should invest money in that, you are very likely to say that it's nonsense and it's based on irrelevant data. But if a nonsense person comes and tells you that, oh, this company is going to perform really bad in the coming few days and weeks, then you're going to leave everything that's around you and start listening to him with all attention and focus. This is what means that pessimism is an idea that is more easily accepted by investors versus optimism. Why is that? The simple reason is because progress, when it happens, it is too slow for you to take notice of. Versus when you see a setback, it's happening so quickly and so rapidly that you cannot ignore it, even if you wish to ignore it. So this idea basically sums up this chapter. So chapter 18 says when you'll believe anything, right? And this basically deals with financial fiction. So this chapter kind of describes how people will believe any information and any fictional stories about finances and investments that comes around to fill in the voids of their financial information. So what this chapter describes is that you should increase the gap between what you want to be true and what you need to be true to prevent yourself from falling victim to these financial stories, right? Try and stick to relevant information and not what is just hearsay. So chapter 19 is basically summing up, titled All Together Now. So let's look at what this basically deals with. First takeaway is go out of your way to find humility when things are going good, and forgiveness or compassion when things go wrong. The second takeaway is less ego means more wealth. The third point is manage money in a way that it helps you sleep at night. The next takeaway is that if you want to increase your prowess as an investor, the single most skill that you should have is that you should be able to increase your timeline or your time span of investments. The next point is that you should be okay with a lot of things going wrong along the way. It is okay for a lot of things to be wrong or not go according to your way, and you'll still end up making a fortune if you give yourself the time. The next takeaway is use money to gain control over time. This is the highest dividend that money will ever pay you. The next takeaway is be nicer and less flashy. Another golden nugget is save. Just save for the heck of saving. The next one is worship the room of error. It's always going to be there, and make sure you account for it. And the last chapter, chapter 20, titled Confessions, basically sums up as follows. There's a quote by Charlie Munger which says, I do not want to be rich, I just want to be financially independent. And I think that says everything about this book. Very aptly also said is a statement which goes as follows, is do not interrupt your financial investments unnecessarily. Thank you for listening to this book review. If you've not already subscribed to our channel, please subscribe and press on the bell icon and share it with your friends who are our age, who are the same age, somebody who's looking for investment advice. This book is a great go-to, a simple read, and definitely a lot of great takeaway points from this.